applications, and staff reports on the city's website are also included in our public notices. I do note that we have 7 of 7 commissioners present, so therefore we do have a quorum. Brandon, do you have any announcements for us?
I do have one announcement in that Susan McCracken-Jane is the newest member of the Public Arts Advisory Committee. So it's kind of a unique role. It's the first time I can recall a sitting planning commissioner also sitting on another commission, but I think you were appointed by the mayor at the last meeting. So congratulations. And that's obviously something that will benefit this commission in terms of having that pollination between other committees. As things come before you, she'll be very familiar with them. And so that's all I have.
Congratulations. Oh, thank you.
Look forward to making everything work on both ends.
Smoothly. Good.
Fine art and building.
Okay, public forum. If you wish to speak on an issue not on the agenda, please fill out a speaker's form. But seeing no one in the audience, I think we're going to skip this part. So we're on to the discussion item, which is the housing element of the comp plan, the housing production strategy, and the housing capacity analysis. Go for it, Brandon.
Thank you. So we are having a little technical difficulty in which this monitor, which was working a moment ago, decided to stop. So I may need to shut down this presentation and start the computer over again unless you guys want to pivot and see it on that screen.
We should all move over there.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to do. Go ahead if you want to.
I'll get started unless there's objections. So.
No, go ahead.
And I would note that this presentation is, because this is a study session, is really intended to be a framework for a discussion. So my intention isn't to go through all of these slides sequentially with no questions or answers. As you guys have questions or want to deliberate amongst yourselves, please feel free. But I felt it would be of value to talk about the housing element, and it actually does have 3 components, because in addition to the housing element itself, which is in your comprehensive plan, we have recently adopted 2 technical support documents to it, one being the housing capacity analysis, the other the housing production strategy. Lastly, I've not included, but the buildable lands inventory is another technical support document that identifies what land is available within the city. It was included as an attachment to the housing capacity analysis, and as such is incorporated into the comprehensive plan. I will note that the city did the housing element update in 2019, so it is the most recent update to our comprehensive plan. The housing capacity analysis we did in 2021, and then in 2023 completed the housing production strategy. Essentially, the housing element does provide all the goals, policies, and policies related to diversity, affordability, sustainability, and ultimately effective planning. Some of the goals that we'll touch on in a moment relate to planning for the future development of housing within the community. So the housing element itself, as I mentioned, was adopted in June of 2019. It ends up guiding the city's development of housing strategies and the housing production strategy. And the ideal is that it actually will influence the development of legislation that this body recommends to the city council, and the city council ultimately approves. And when I say legislation, the housing element can influence both land use regulation, has influenced the development of ordinances for the adoption of a housing trust fund, can function to guide policy decisions in terms of use of city revenues. For instance, the allocation of the revenue or the tax revenue from the marijuana sales tax actually was directed into the housing trust fund by determination from the city council upon recognizing that that furthers the goals in the housing element. One thing to note is the housing element does not function as an independent approval criteria for individual planning actions, and I'll go into that in a bit. Between when we last met and this evening, I did have the opportunity to look at some LUBA case law, which is always thrilling, but looking specifically at Ashland cases, and some are rather interesting. I don't have slides on them, but I'll touch on them as we come to the individual goals.
Brandon?
Yes.
Just a quick question. The 2019 adoption of the housing element, was that a revision of a different housing element, or did it not exist prior?
There was a housing element that had been in existence since, I believe, 1989 that was, I'd say revised, but it was a repeal and replace. So the entirety of the housing element was removed and replaced with the one that was drafted in 2019 after about 18 months of work with the Housing and Human Services Commission and the Housing and Human Services Commission at the time, now the Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee, and this body took it to council. One thing you'll note in looking at the housing element is it has some information from census year comparisons. It was somewhat of a quandary in 2018-19 when that was being developed because we didn't have 2020 census information yet. But in order to have direct comparables, it used the 2010 census. And that's really why the housing capacity analysis and these technical documents are so important, as it gives us a way to, in lieu of updating the element itself, reference current information. So the housing capacity analysis does look at the American Community Survey data from 2020, as well as from years prior. So it's a better way to update the housing element. For instance, the buildable lands inventory, our goal is to update that every few years. We're actually in the process of updating it now, and we'll be bringing it back to you to show how much land has been consumed. Long answer to your question. It was an entirely new effort to draft that element. So.
The only thing I was trying to determine was whether or not it was a slight edit or a full revision.
It was a full revision. I think prior there was 15 individual policies and one goal. At the conclusion of that effort, there were 4 primary goals and I think 26 policies.
So different now, yeah.
Yeah. And
question, please? So what is is there a standard for what, how frequently updates should happen, or what, defines currency in a plan like this?
Not a numeric standard that I've seen. I know that the Department of Land Conservation and Development acknowledged the completion of a comprehensive plan when it was done, and had an objective to do what they call periodic review, where every 5 years or so they would review your existing comprehensive plan and ensure that it's still in compliance with changes in state law. My understanding is the Department of Land Conservation and Development has not been doing periodic reviews, and so individual communities have been updating specific elements when necessary. And that is defined by each jurisdiction as to which is most pressing. I would say that there are a number of chapters within our existing comprehensive plan that are out of date, much like the housing element was prior to 2019. And so it would be the City Council establishing a priority to update a specific element. The next one in the pipeline is it's not the element itself, but the transportation system plan, which is the primary technical support document of the transportation element. And the expectation / hope is that that will be done in this year, in 2024. So.
Okay. And so related question, is there an update anticipated because of the CFAC changes and so forth, or is that again taken kind of iteratively, sorry,
yeah.
as it comes?
I would say no, there's not an anticipated update due to CFAC or the climate-friendly area designations. Clearly,
I meant to the housing plan,
right.
The housing element as a result of CFAC.
So as CFAC was originally written, there was a requirement to create a climate-friendly element in comp plans for all cities. And I believe the uproar across the state caused them to change their mind and backpedal on that. So the changes to CFEC that happened in last November, I believe, got rid of that requirement.
Okay.
You know, I think that one of the things to consider in looking at our comprehensive plan is that the policies and goals should be providing a goal or policy that is in some ways timeless. You know, I don't think the intent is within the elements to establish a goal for what we're going to do in 2026. And then when that's met, come up with another goal for 2027. So, you know, we can touch on some of these goals, and I think that was the objective in redoing the housing element, was to remove a lot of the time-sensitive nature of the information in the prior housing element that was either out of date or no longer relevant, and update the goals and policies to be, again, more aspirational in terms of what we would like to see as a community. And that's a good segue into goal number 1, which is to ensure a range of different dwelling types that provide living opportunities for the total cross-section of Ashland's population. And you see 5 policies listed here. There's actually 9, so I've got another slide. But again, the intent on this was to look at having housing that is covers the cross-section both of income and, you know, for instance, provide accessible design for people at different stages of life, or, you know, providing housing for seniors and disabled persons, provide housing opportunities for people without discrimination. This is more of a fair housing goal. And in terms of the work that you do, ensuring that we zone sufficient land area to accommodate a variety of housing types. You know, if a community was all zoned for 1 acre minimum lot size, that would not necessarily address the full cross-section of Ashland's population. Many people do like a 1 acre property, but it's not necessarily financially attainable. And as such, a full cross-section of housing types, single-family apartments, condominiums, cottage housing, studio apartments, all of them are needed, as is evidenced in the housing capacity analysis. And so when we look at our zoning map and compare it to the buildable lands inventory, we not only have to make sure that we've zoned enough land for those uses, but that we have existing capacity for the development of them over the next 20-year period. Ideally beyond that, but that's the minimum requirement under state law.
Just to touch on that, the conversations that I recall so far is that when we've talked about buildable lands, we haven't talked about zoning of those lands and whether or not they are actually set up in a way that can meet what we see to be our aspirational goals of the types of housing that we're looking to have built. Have I just not heard something about that, or is this work to be done?
Yeah, no, I think that was largely the housing capacity analysis looked at the prior buildable lands inventory and looked at the zoning allocations and how much land was available in each zone and what the allowable uses are in each zone. So for instance, R2, R3 are our multifamily zones, that we were right on the cusp of having just a 20-year supply of those lands, considering annexation of lands that are within our urban growth boundary. But within the city limits alone, there's not a 20-year supply, whereas there was a surplus of single-family R15 zoned lands. And so, you know, part of that housing capacity analysis and trying to marry the buildable lands with what could actually be built on them, and then what the housing need is based on some assumptions that are outlined in that document, such as population growth, household demographics, income distribution. Household size is a big one. You know, when I started working for the city, I think we were at 2.9 people per household. Mm-hmm. We're at 1.9 now. So just by merit of that kind of reduction in the number of people per house, you need more houses to accommodate the same number of people. Right. So that was the effort that was done in the housing capacity analysis. And then from that, it was determined that, I'll be blunt, building out in the same manner as had been done historically, of having the majority of development be single-family homes with a small percentage of multifamily, was going to perpetuate that inequity going forward. And so the housing production strategy, looking at the housing capacity analysis, really flipped that and said that we need to provide a significantly more multifamily housing than single-family housing. And with that assumption, then, do we have the land available for that use zoned appropriately? The buildable lands inventory and the housing capacity analysis demonstrated that we did. But again, that is, it was again a margin, it was a thin margin in terms of multifamily high-density housing. I think things like the climate-friendly and equitable communities wasn't considered in that analysis. That provides more opportunities for higher density housing on land that was not considered for residential development under that analysis. So it's always changing, but again, that's why we have you guys to look at those things when it comes forward.
There are a lot of parts and pieces moving in this all at the same time, I get. But initially out the gate, that those two studies came out and said that this is the type of housing that we need to do if we're going to balance the collection of houses across the AMIs
Right.
segments that are out there, and it's already zoned that way. Okay, tick, first thing is at least we've got it zoned properly if we intend to build there, if someone intends to
Right.
build there. Yeah.
So Brandon, are you saying, you're concluding then that with CFAC folded in and the other things that have come along since the two studies were done, that we do have more than 20 years?
Presumably, we haven't yet adopted the climate-friendly areas,
Okay.
but the intention of identifying Croman area, Transit Triangle area, the railroad area, and the downtown, which actually doesn't have a lot of development capacity, but
Right.
meets some of the CFAC requirements. Those other areas could have an intensification of use and increase the amount of higher density housing, which was the area that we were at the margin on. So that would increase that supply once adopted.
Okay, so we can make, if we make the assumption that we're going to do something with Croman, something multifamily with Croman, then we can rest assured that we will exceed our 20-year goal.
Yeah, so Croman currently is zoned for office, employment, and industrial with very limited housing. So if the alternative put forth by Townmakers LLC to have, mixed use development and incorporate a significant amount of housing, that adds to the capacity that we didn't previously plan for.
Okay, thank you.
So again, if you guys want me to touch on any individual goal, I'm happy to do so, but or any policy, but I was really intending to just hit on the primary goals and not go through each policy. The second goal was to support the creation and preservation of housing that's affordable to low and moderate income households that's commensurate with the incomes of Ashland's workforce. This goal, it talks about the preservation of affordable housing. Often we'll look at grant opportunities to maintain the affordability of USDA apartments, for instance, that are provided in Ashland, and ensure that those can remain affordable with an infusion of rehabilitation funds, or utilizing the Housing Trust Fund to encourage the creation of affordable housing. Obviously the city of Ashland has not been a housing developer ourselves, and so we work collaboratively with nonprofit organizations that develop affordable housing, and we also work with market rate developers to build affordable housing when required of annexations or zone changes. So those partnerships are essential to make sure that we can't create new affordable housing. I would point out in this goal that one of the issues that came up in doing the housing production strategy was the retention of manufactured housing parks as a housing type that is specifically affordable to incomes of Ashland's workforce and preservation of that housing type. And so when we get to touch on the housing production strategy, that was one that the council ultimately directed to be something that we move forward with in short order in order to provide for that needed housing type. Number 17 on this is one that was newly added in 2019, evaluate the cost of public infrastructure in relation to the impact on the cost of housing. Part of that was a concern that when the city does capital improvement projects and identifies where the city is going to be investing in public facility improvements, that there be a consideration of how does that work in relation to facilitating the development of housing in that area. But I also think that this section relates to the cost of the proportionate share of systems development charges that affordable housing would have to pay. And so the city has adopted policies to allow us to waive all systems development charges for affordable housing, and those charges, as you likely know, cover things like transportation impacts, water, sewer, parks. But by recognizing that those costs that can be sizable, $12,000, $15,000 per dwelling unit, being exempted for affordable housing is one way to the city to contribute and in some way subsidize the development of that needed housing type.
Question,
Yeah,
if I may.
Please.
Policy
I can go back.
one, yeah, go back, please. 16. Is there anything within our code right now that would be a tool should someone want to start gentrifying a neighborhood and demolishing existing lower cost house, nothing is low cost in Ashland, and start to build it out in a way that it's not congruent with the neighborhood itself?
Sure. There's two things that come to mind, and Derek, if you can think of others. One, we have a demolition ordinance that in order for somebody to demolish a building, they have to demonstrate that it's, one, not economically feasible to retain the building, so it's in such a state of disrepair that it would cost more to preserve it than it would be to replace it. So again, I don't think that addresses the concern that you're raising, because somebody could identify properties that are in a dilapidated state, demolish them, and rebuild them. The other in our historic districts that comes to mind is a maximum permitted floor area, which was created, and I don't recall the year, probably 2006, 7, when there was concern of just that happening, people buying small dwellings within our National Register historic districts and demolishing them to build McMansions. And so by establishing a ordinance that establishes the maximum permitted floor area for buildings, and it does change depending on how many units are being provided, but it's proportionate to the lot size. And in that way, a small lot could not be demolished, and a house could not be demolished and replaced with a very large home. Maximum house size of 3,249 square feet was the cap on that. So again, I don't think it really, another section of ordinance that just popped into my mind is we did a condominium conversion ordinance that in the case of an apartment building that somebody wanted to convert all into condominiums, they currently, if that, it's not true for apartments that were built after the effective date of that ordinance, so a new apartment wouldn't be subject to this. But for long-standing apartments, if somebody were to convert that into condominiums, there's a metric in our ordinance that requires either a percentage be affordable condominiums for sale or a percentage be retained as market rate rentals, as to not lose that housing type that's needed. So those are a couple examples where.
Good, thank you.
So let me just play off that. So what if you have an apartment building? Well, maybe by definition it would fall under the restrictions. So what if you had an apartment building that had affordable units in it, so they were lower rent, and somebody wanted to condominiumize the apartments, or all the apartments? Would you require them to keep the affordable units?
Well, we'd have to look specifically at how those units are considered affordable. If they're just voluntarily have low rents and they're not deed restricted, or in some way regulated as affordable, they could go through the condominium conversion to convert to condominiums for sale. Some of those units, again, would have to either be affordable units for sale, or they could retain a percentage as affordable rentals or market rate rentals. There's a couple alternatives in that ordinance. If it was a deed restricted affordable housing apartment complex, let's say the Housing Authority, Snowberry, 60 units of affordable housing on Snowberry 1, they could not convert that into condominiums because of the 60-year deed restriction on that property currently.
Okay, so is there any way to get, in your scenario, is there, instead of market rate rental housing, is there any way to get lower rent affordable housing?
Yeah, the ordinance that was adopted does have a lesser requirement if you're willing to have affordable rental housing. I think it's, I think it's 50% of the units would have to be retained as market rate rentals, or 25% as affordable rentals, and the other 75% as market rate condominiums. So again, we could look at that section of code to get you the actual numbers. I will say that since that was passed in 2008 or 9, we had a recession immediately after, and the rush to convert apartments into condominiums stopped, and we have not seen that happen since that I'm aware of. It only applies to apartments of 4 units or greater, and again, ones that were built prior to the date of that ordinance. So. But that could be seen as a creative solution to address needed housing and retention of housing, back to Doug's point. So goal 3 is really the more protecting the natural environment, which is to encourage the development of housing in ways that protects the natural environment and encourage the development patterns that reduce effects of climate change. So although this preceded CFEC, I think this goal does in part align with that. One of the things that I'll note in this goal is when we talk about promoting infill and compact development patterns to encourage housing affordability, maximize existing land use, and conserve habitat in environmentally sensitive areas. I want to touch on the promote infill and compact development, because that is one of the LUBA cases that I was looking at in Ashland in 2001. So it predates this specific policy, but there was a policy in the prior housing element that talked about having a compact urban form. And the city had applied for and ultimately approved the development of the Community Development and Engineering Services building that I work in every day. That building, the application for it was appealed in Thomas versus City of Ashland up to LUBA under the standard that the city, in approving the development on that site, did not adequately, the appeal contended that the city should have looked at the compact urban form to require 2 or more stories on that property and not only build a 1-story structure. There was neighbor concerns over a 2-story structure, and I'm sure financing concerns. Ultimately, the proposal was for a 1-story office building, and that was approved by the city council. Upon appeal to LUBA, LUBA affirmed the city's approval and said that the city cannot use, or not this, that the appellant was using a comprehensive plan policy as an individual criteria of approval for a planning action, and that was not appropriate. And as such, the appeal was denied and the approval stood. There are cases that I came across that showed where the city had explicitly stated in the comprehensive plan that all developments shall, and not necessarily in City of Ashland, meet the following criteria, or it was included in their land use ordinance that a development shall meet the criteria in the comprehensive plan as follows. Those do become criteria that can be applied to planning actions. Anyway, so there's differing case law depending on the specifics of the proposal. But in general, the findings that the Land Use Board of Appeals had forwarded often stipulated that the policies and goals within a comprehensive plan are not individual criteria of approval for planning actions.
And so is the difference then is in the wording, that the more specific it is, the more likely it's able to be used on individual applications?
I think
versus aspirational?
I think, yeah, aspirational, should be converted into an implementable criteria within the land use ordinance. So, for instance, if we have a criteria that says development standards shall be used to fit development to topography, generally following the concept that density should decrease on physically and environmentally constrained lands, the policy number 18 in this list. The adoption of our physical environmental constraints, hillside development standards, is more specific. It's saying explicitly that development on lands over 35% is not permissible unless there's no alternative, that between 25 and 35% you need a geotechnical engineer to assert that it is developable. So in that sense, there's more specificity in the land use ordinance that implements a policy number 18. And so it would be inappropriate for an appellant to say, if something met all of the physical environmental constraints review criteria, that their interpretation is that that density doesn't fit that topography. So that's really where the distinction is that we should take these goals and ensure that when we're adopting new land use policies, that they're not in conflict with these goals and that they support them. Does that? Sure.
Thank you.
And so goal number 4, forecast and plan for changing housing policy needs over time in relation to land supply and housing production. That's in part where we started this discussion, talking about the housing capacity analysis and buildable lands inventory. That policy number 2, maintaining a database of the amount of vacant land and land consumption. That's the buildable lands inventory. Our senior planner, Aaron Anderson, is working on updating that right now. It was last updated in 2019. And so we will be coming back before this body with really an update of that. And we're doing it at this point in order to have a factual basis for the economic opportunities analysis that will follow. So although the intention is to fully inventory economic opportunities within the community or land for employment or industrial, it'll have the benefit of satisfying this criteria in terms of measuring the amount of land available for housing development. And when we talk about encouraging development of vacant lands within the city limits, while looking at lands within the urban growth boundary to provide sufficient land for future housing needs, I think this gets to our annexation criteria, that we have criteria that points to the metering in of land from the urban growth boundary into the city limits, that it has to be adjacent to the city limits, that the applicant is, we used to have a criteria that there had to be less than a 5-year supply within the city, but that became really an impediment to seeing annexations move forward. And ultimately the council removed that goal at the Planning Commission and staff's recommendation and removed that ordinance from our annexation ordinance. But again, the idea is that promoting infill, look for opportunities within the existing city limits and ensure that those properties can be developed. It's an interesting one, and when I was looking at the LUBA appeals of City of Ashland, Community Hospital, which is now Asante, had applied for the development of vacant property to accommodate 4 medical office buildings over off of Maple Street, and neighborhood appellants came forward and said that that was in violation of the city's comprehensive plan goal to provide a park within a quarter mile of every household, that vacant land could be and had been used by the neighborhood as open space, even though it was privately owned. Ultimately, Luba, again, said that that is not a clear and objective criteria in the land use ordinance, but a comprehensive plan goal, and that the property could develop in conformance with its underlying zoning. So that ultimately was approved.
Chair, I have a question.
Sure.
Policy 24, growth management planning on a regional basis. Would that be the, what was it called, the Rogue Valley?
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Derek, who spent 12 years of his life working on that plan, and he can describe it a little bit.
But, well, first, quick question, was it ever actually adopted, or did it
Yes,
just?
I believe it was the first and maybe only such effort in the state under the laws that enabled it. And it took us 12 years.
And it's called the Regional Problem Solving, or RPS plan, and I think there was now times 2.
There was an initial now times 2. I think it's technically called the Greater Bear Creek Valley Regional Problem Solving Agreement.
Okay.
There's also a book written about it.
But before you go in and explain what you're doing, let me tell you the reason for my question, which is that when we talk about housing in Ashland, we tend to talk about it in like a test tube, like it all has to happen within Ashland. So when I saw this policy out there that is on the books, we're recognizing that, you know, we can coordinate with surrounding communities, and Talent, Phoenix, as the case may be. We expected to do that, perhaps, and that's where I ended up finding the plan that apparently you worked on for so long.
And that agreement, I mean, there was a perception that Ashland was saying we didn't want to grow through that whole agreement. And it wasn't that at all. We actually had to argue that if we didn't want to expand our boundaries, we should still be allocated the population that we anticipated to have over the time period, so that we could grow. But we felt that we could accommodate the anticipated growth over a doubling of the valley's population within our boundaries through more efficient land use. And through that process, it also came to adopting some safe harbor densities for development in the other communities. So before they could add to their urban growth boundaries, they had to demonstrate that the development occurring inside their boundaries was at those at least minimum densities in the eyes of the state and the other participants in that process.
Okay.
I have a question. So one sort of technical question on this section and one more broad question. In terms of data inventories and so forth, where does the responsibility for identifying lot lines lie? And is it part of this data mapping process, or?
So Jackson County provides the tax lot base layer that shows lot lines that, and when a survey is done for a partition or subdivision, Jackson County again is the jurisdiction that would take all of those lines and both archive them and put them on the map that we use then.
So they flow into the data?
Yeah, so our
city has.
GIS division, our Geographic Information System, does pull directly from Jackson County the data that they update and maintain.
Okay. And a more general question, and I don't know whether it pertains to this section or somewhere else, but I didn't see any mention of historical quality of housing and that in any regard, because it seems to me that one of the selling points of Ashland, quite frankly, is its stock of historical housing, and also coming from Boston, where lots of historical housing was torn down for quote-unquote urban renewal that was later regretted publicly and elsewise. I'm sure Lisa saw those case studies as well. So is that covered somewhere else, or?
Pardon me. Yeah, there is, well, I'm trying to think. I don't think there's a specific element, but we do have 4 National Register Historic Districts. We do have, requirements for site design review, as you guys are familiar with the recent application for development within a historic district. There's additional design standards that apply. The demolition ordinance that I referenced earlier, I think was largely intended in order to preserve historic properties. There's a provision in there that if a building is over 45 years old, it has to go through that process. When that demolition ordinance was done, there was not allowance under state law to require preservation of historic buildings. I believe there's been some state law changes since that were we to revisit the demolition ordinance, we could do so. But yeah, I don't believe the housing element actually references the value of historic districts. There is chapter 1 of the comprehensive plan talks about the historic overview of Ashland and the value of a historic commission to preserve the integrity of those districts. But it's not overtly mentioned in the housing element that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, do we actually designate historic properties, or do we have a historic district?
We have, in each of our historic districts, there's designations, and Derek, being the liaison to the Historic Commission, could probably speak to it, but there is a full inventory of every property within those districts that identifies whether the building is a contributing historic resource, and I'm forgetting the other categories, or has some measure of historic integrity but has been remodeled to a degree that, or is not contributory to the district, you know, a new house, for instance. And so there's also individually listed properties within those historic districts that, you know, have a higher burden in terms of that individual listing.
In the sense of having a register, you know, that says this property, that property, this property are recognized as.
Right. I think some of the individually listed received a tax deferral for doing upkeep to those buildings, and as such are obligated under the State Historic Preservation Office. Carrie may know.
Well, it's state, it's not local. I mean, so it's
Right.
not Ashland recognizing them, it's state, they're state and federal historic.
Yeah, so we started with 4 local districts that we regulated. In about 99 or 2000, we went through the process to designate National Register districts for all 4 of those districts. They're not exactly coinciding in the maps because the National Register has a requirement for a certain number of historically significant structures, a percentage within each district. So the boundaries were adjusted a little bit, so you'll see a variation between local and national. And then if somebody wants to have their property put on the National Register individually, they apply through the State Historic Preservation Office, and they provide an assessment of the historic significance of the property and a plan of what they intend to do to improve that, and it has to be a certain value in relation to the benefit they're going to get from a property tax freeze. And then they also have to be willing, at least until COVID, they had to be willing to do some sort of like educational open house annually so that they could promote historic preservation as well.
That's a new piece. I had no idea that it went up to the national level to have that type of conversation. Okay, thank you.
And we have local standards that regulate what can be done to buildings in the district, and they also incorporate a set of national standards as well. So.
All right.
Yeah, and the districts you'd be familiar with, the Railroad District is one, the Downtown District, the Hargadine, and then the Skidmore District. So basically the 3 major residential areas around the proximity of the downtown, and the downtown would be those 4 districts. You know, interestingly, there is discussion among housing and, the Historic Preservation Advisory Committee that we have other areas in town that at the time that those inventories were done in 2000 were not considered historic, but given that 45-year-old areas like Oak Knoll, or I'm sorry, not Oak Knoll, the Quiet Village would be considered historic under some designations because those buildings were built in the mid-70s. So as we get older, things that we see as non-historic are rapidly becoming so, or at least that's my experience.
Or I live in a 1911 house that is ignored by these things because the college has kind of subsumed around it.
Yeah, and again, there are a number of individual historic homes around town that aren't within those National Register historic districts. One of the individually listed buildings that comes to mind is on the college campus, right at the corner. I'm forgetting the name of the
Across
building.
the street from
Thank
me.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is opportunities to individually list properties, but it's not a full district because it doesn't meet that percentage threshold that over 50% of the units within the district are historic contributing.
And we had issues with the school district, the bond measure before last, wanting to demolish the historic portion of Bellevue School. And so we had to rely on the comprehensive plan and quite a bit of negotiation to convince them that that was significant and needed to be preserved as part of that project. And the commission was instrumental in that.
So housing capacity analysis, we did touch on it. It's really that looking at whether we have adequate capacity for housing going forward. The key findings in the housing capacity analysis, one, that Ashland's population growth is slow. We're looking at a population growth of 0.37% per year. And as such, when we talk about a 20-year land supply, as that population growth has reduced year over year and is flattening out, that actually extends the capacity of land to out further into the future. But with that said, it was identified that Ashland needed to plan for, in that 20-year period, 858 new dwelling units to accommodate 1,691 new residents in our community. And that averages 43 dwelling units per year. So it's interesting in looking at the population element in the comprehensive plan, as outdated as it is. It projected that we would have a population growth that was linear of 85 people per year. And they made that projection under John Fregonesi long ago, and it's actually held. It's not the projection that we use because the state law requires us to use Portland State University projections, and that's what was used in this analysis. But nonetheless, it's just interesting that 43 dwelling units would accommodate about 85 people. So it's still spot on after many, many decades. And lastly, that Ashland had adequate land capacity to accommodate those dwelling units over the next 20 years. The housing capacity analysis did go on to discuss that unmet housing need that I brought up earlier, that disproportionate development of single family over the last few decades, creating an environment where multifamily wasn't keeping up with demand. Interestingly, this last year, we had far more multifamily housing units built than single family homes. So I don't think that's a reflection of the housing capacity analysis, but a turn in the market that's occurred. But essentially, in order to accommodate for that discrepancy, the intention was to plan the historic 66% of the housing is single family and 35% of housing is single family detached, that the city looked at modifying those development patterns to be 35% of new housing being multifamily, and then providing 10% as duplex, triplex, or quads. So essentially at that, you're at 45% of housing developed in the future for the projection of land need as being multifamily housing types. And that's exclusive of single family attached housing like townhomes and single family detached.
Do you count cottage housing as single family, or is?
Cottage housing counts as single family housing.
Okay.
So it's at a higher density, but it's still a model of individual owner occupied housing units that are on their own tax lots. So, looking at where that capacity is though, a lot of it is outside of the city limits. So within the urban growth boundary, I have a little zoom in on the map here from our buildable lands inventory showing the normal neighborhood. That's a big chunk of where future development would occur. So when you look at the buildable lands inventory, there's a large number of individual small lots scattered throughout neighborhoods throughout town that could have capacity of 1 or 2 or 3 units. But really, when you're looking at economies of scale, you're looking at large vacant parcels, and it's really land that's between the city limits and the urban growth boundary that would satisfy that. All right, any questions on housing capacity analysis before I go on to housing production strategy?
So it's the green thing that's the normal neighborhood?
So let me get a pointer here.
Let me rephrase that. Where's the normal neighborhood?
This area right here, the blue line is the city limits.
Oh.
This red dash line is the urban growth boundary. So it's this whole area, this is like Temple of Mech Shalom is where my pointer is now. The LDS church is right here. So there's, some church properties along East Main, but the interior of this is 22 lots, of which many are significantly oversized. In the south east corner here, there are a number of individual homes on large lots that are not likely to redevelop given the configuration. But the remainder of that could accommodate approximately 450 dwelling units according to the normal neighborhood plan.
So, are those 6 or 7 or 8 large lots, or are they still fighting that from going forward?
I guess I don't understand the question.
Well, I know there's a normal neighborhood plan, but those people that are on large lots in the normal neighborhood have done a pretty good job of keeping any of that development from happening.
Yeah. So, I think, I mentioned that annexation has to occur when you're adjacent to city limits. A number of properties that are on the city limits boundaries are owned by developers that have an intention to annex into the city. Mm-hmm. There are property owners within the area that have significant development capacity on their property, but don't have any interest in coming into the city or annexing. So this is probably a temporal issue that over time, people will sell their property or their children will inherit it. And, one of the individuals that had property out there that had no interest in developing has since relocated, and the purchaser has inquired about the potential of annexing. They're not next to city limits, so they can't do so.
I see.
But
so the people that are right on the city limit can block the rest of those people from moving forward with development?
I would say it's the people on the interior of those that don't want to develop. So they're not necessarily on the perimeter. So, and annexation is not compulsory. The city has typically taken the position that, the value added on through annexation is something that will drive development. And so the properties will approach the city when the market is right for that annexation, and they can cover the development costs associated with it. And they're not insignificant in this area. The new roads, the improvements to East Main Street, railroad crossing, I don't want to diminish that in any sense, because that's a significant lift for the development community to come forward with a project that pencils. But nonetheless, it does have that development capacity. So when we talk about within our city limits, it alone can't really satisfy our 20-year supply. We are going to be required to look at annexations to satisfy that.
I'm just going to point out that the counselor has a question.
Oh, okay. Paula? Councilor Haya?
Thanks, Lisa. I'm just curious, Brandon, I vaguely remember when people hook into city services, I think it was up off of Peachy and Paradise Lane. Is that a case where then we immediately annex in, or we have like an exercisable option in the
Yeah.
future, for lack of a better way to put it?
I think the way that you put it second is exactly right. It's called an irrevocable consent to annexation, that we
Okay.
require a property owner to sign a document to that effect, that if they are connecting to city services, that should an annexation be proposed, they can't stand in the way of that. So the idea being is that they've already received an extension of water, sewer, they're benefiting from those city services, and so the city could initiate an annexation of that property. Usually as part of a broader annexation. If it was one property that would be an island, you would want to bring it in at that time. Does that
Thank you.
Okay.
I have another question on annexation. Thinking back to my Washington State days, annexations, if 75% of the property owners got together and wanted to annex into a city, but they were not adjacent to the city limits, they could bring in the other 25% of the annexation that was presumably between the city limits and them as part of their annexation, and the people in the 25% couldn't opt out. Is there anything like that here in Oregon?
There's something like about 50% of the taxing areas. But
Yeah, there's a couple options that get into
Where you can drag somebody in?
triple majority that we discussed under the Grand Terrace annexation when Roger Pierce was here with his background in land use law. And I think it was 50% of the property owners had to be in favor, 50% at least, and they had to control at least 50% of the land value in the area and some other element of that majority, I think 50% of the voters as well, of the electors within the annexed area.
Okay.
And you had to have the consent of 50% of the voters, 50% of the property owners, and represent that valuation. And if that was the case, you could do it without an actual election.
Okay, but I guess what I'm asking is, can you drag in that other 50%, even though they don't want it?
Theoretically, you could, yeah. And our code also has that provision to say that the staff advisor can recommend the inclusion of additional properties, although I don't think we typically would do that of a private property unless that property owner was in agreement.
So,
or we have an irrevocable consent.
yeah, and an example in this, where the cursor is presently, in the normal area, a property here, for instance, is not necessarily touching the blue line. It has the railroad between them. But if that property was looking at annexing the area of railroad right-of-way between the city limits and that subject property, could be part of that 50% of area to be included in the annexation. And as such, not necessarily need the railroad to consent to annexation as part of that.
Yeah, isn't that what happened with Grand Terrace?
It is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but for the most part, I think that the intention of having the adjacency to city limits is really one for the extension of city services in a systematic way, as opposed to leapfrogging or having, long flags leading out to annexed areas that are separated by county property. So I'll go quickly through the housing production strategy, as it's the most recent document, and some of you commissioners were on this body when it came through and was approved in 2023. It really identified 4 areas of objectives. One, encourage low and moderate income housing to be developed, rental housing specifically, increase opportunities for affordable ownership, encourage development of income restricted affordable housing, and lastly, preserve existing and low and moderate income affordable housing. I think that this table, which is probably too small to really see, but I can read you the numbers, is one of the more interesting ones in terms of how those 858 units based on population growth would be expected to be distributed based on historic incomes and the job sectors of our community. Essentially, it does show that there is, the top bar here is new housing. This is existing housing. So it's showing out of our essentially 9,000 plus housing units in Ashland that 2,000 households are extremely low income, 3,100 have what's called high income of over 120% median, and as such a distribution of the housing units that would be needed to accommodate that future growth. So it essentially says that we need 178 units for extremely low income, 133 for very low income, that's less than 50% the median income, 127 units of between 50 and 80% median income, 144 units of between 80 and 120% median income, which is often referred to as kind of the missing middle housing area. And lastly, 277 units for higher income. It's that last 277 that the market typically provides for. It's the others that are a little more difficult and sometimes require additional subsidy or higher densities in order to achieve. And so with that metric,
Sorry,
Brandon,
one question.
quick question
Yeah.
on that. Yeah, you're first.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just looking at making the spread of the housing production plan as essentially a percent of existing doesn't seem to align with what we're saying we want to do as a community as far as starting to have some more equity in the various AMI levels that we're talking about. For example, I just played around with it, and if there was nothing done in the greater than 120% and we built all the rest out, we would end up through the categories, the four to the left there, at 178, 210, 226, 244, essentially building about the same amount of housing in each one of those levels if we could get the developers, interested in a way that would make that happen. So as we're looking at planning going forward, are we setting up our incentives? Are we setting up our decisions in a way that can start to build that middle because that's what we say we want to do? Or do we just let the market do what it's going to do and we're going to react to it? That's the question that I have. It's for the planning commission too.
yeah, I would say the market is not going to address this.
No, I don't
This
see it
area.
addressing it. I see it addressing the upper end simply because, but we also need to go down farther into those AMI levels as best we can without bankrupting the city, to try and make those happen too, because we think it's important to have a good mix of incomes and people in this town. And that's where I've been spending time thinking is what can we do, what are we already doing, which we need to have lots of conversations about to try and make that happen. And it's not just incentives directly, it's occasionally disincentives, which I'm not going to go into here.
Yeah, I think there's many ways to approach it. One being that the assumption used in this is based on, future residents of Ashland having incomes that are commensurate with what incomes are available in the community now.
You have to start
So there's an economic development arm to this as well, that if the job base could increase such that incomes increased, you can address it from the other side of the coin. But again, I think that you're right that if left entirely to market rate development, if, we zoned the entire city, single family detached 1 acre minimum lot size, you'd be clearly addressing the high income 120% and above, but you'd not be getting any apartments that are affordable to people at the 80% or 100% median income.
Right. So if we're already oversubscribed at that level, what can we do in the other areas for the planned selling price of the units that are being proposed? That's what I want to take a look at and see if there's anything that we can do that falls within the bounds of both, doing it legally and
Well, I think you're
trying to
giving
get to
me
the place that we say we want to get to.
Yeah, you're giving me a good segue into what the housing strategies that the commission and council adopted to try and, again, skew the development pattern to promote those needed housing types that the market isn't otherwise providing.
I'd like to say I did that on purpose, but I'll take credit.
Susan?
So, kind of related, I think. What came across to me in reading this, and is to a certain extent reflected in this chart, is a discussion of a barbell effect. High-income housing, low-income housing. And I didn't see a lot of discussion of the middle. You know, how do we attract early professionals? You know, how do we, my daughter, for example, would love to live here, and she's finishing her master's degree at SOU, but she doesn't feel that she can actually afford to live in Ashland. But, you know, she's a young householder, the kind of people who will help to perpetuate the community and its growth over time. So maybe this is a beyond housing discussion, or goes to the, the data that come from, that we're obliged to use. But I felt it was an important point to make, because it troubles me a little bit that I keep seeing this kind of barbell reflection in the discussion points.
Yeah, I think it's an astute observation. And I'll probably point back to, a new graduate is probably looking at job opportunities in the Valley as well, that can provide a wage that is commensurate with what housing costs in the community. And there's a disconnect there, and in this community, as in much of the West Coast as well. But specifically in terms of higher wage jobs earning more than 120% median income, our community has a service sector economy, right, in large part, and that is lower wage jobs. There's been some synergy in terms of having a university with students that are working their way through school, providing those, filling those job opportunities, but it doesn't answer the question what they do when they graduate, and how do they find a job and find a house that is affordable to them. There is, I know, efforts outside of the city of individuals looking to form a housing land trust to specifically with the intention of providing a housing stock for working families and people that make over 80% median income but less than 120%. I think that when you look at federal or state subsidies, they're typically not targeted to those households. So when we're looking at developing affordable housing, it's because that's where the resources are. But it is a policy question in terms of what do we promote, what do we allow. In our annexation criteria, we were recognizing that in the land use ordinance that there may be opportunities for market rate developers to provide housing at 120% median income to satisfy their affordable housing requirement, but it's a sliding scale. They have to provide 33% of the units at that income level, or only 15% at the 60% AMI. And so we've typically seen for market developers look at that 15% of the units at the lower income level as more attainable from their market analysis than subsidizing units at 120% area median income. But it doesn't answer your question. It's a broad one that I think has been percolating for 20 years, and hopefully we can make some progress on it.
Well, it does go, back to a lot of things that you've already talked about, regional planning. So someone coming from Atlanta thinks it absolutely no problem to drive to Central Point or White City for a job, right? Because you drive that far to stay in the same town in suburban Atlanta as a commute. Or, and average commute levels in the United States are 20 to 25 minutes. So what we seem as extreme here is actually normal in a lot of other places. And the effect to which the elasticity of demand affects the demand for houses. So I hear from realtors that, the $400,000 to $500,000 category, which is supposedly average, is, the fastest selling category because it's the most understocked, and that's where people like my daughter are trying to I guess my point is that as we think about the, philosophically where we want Ashland to be in the future and the role that housing plays in that we don't lose either the regionality or the elasticity of demand or this middle that seems to be somehow not a focus of the strategy, in my humble opinion.
Well, I think you're onto something very, very good there, Commissioner. Ideally, I would like us to see a stepped ability within the value of the houses here that are available so that people can step through them and not have to leave the area. Because my thinking has been more along the lines of people, I would love to attract more work from home type of individuals in order to get a younger cohort of people living in Ashland. We can sell our lifestyle, that's easy. We need a way that we can get them here and they can afford the types of housing that we offer. And I think we can't solve it on the Planning Commission. This is land use. We have limited capabilities in this area. But I'm starting to get the feel that we have some tools, and the reason for tonight, was to kind of talk about what's out there and where the policies lie and what we're bouncing off of when we're making decisions in order to say, how receptive are we to the types of proposals that come before us? And from my perspective, and I can speak only for myself, to see another large mansion come before us that requires 3 variances and a couple of exceptions in order to make it happen, I'm not so certain that I'm willing to sign up for that automatically and twist myself into knots to try and figure out how to make that happen. When what I'm really interested in is seeing something about $400,000 less being proposed, even if it's a couple of them on that same property. Now that's speaking out of line for a planning commissioner perhaps, but that is my view as to how we plan the city, not just the individual projects that come before us. And I think it is our job as a planning commission to look at the city and how we want it to be built and where things should happen and where they would reside. Yeah, it's been on my mind.
Not to throw water on your parade, but you have to make sure that that whoever owns the land wants to develop it in the way that you want it to develop.
Well, you can't stop it. I mean, when I was thinking this through, if a developer comes in with a buy right opportunity, it gets approved.
Well, or we say no to the exceptions and the various variances and things that have to go along with it in order to make it work. So maybe that's a segue into the rest of Brandon's presentation, which is what the housing production strategy, the 8 things that it envisions us doing.
Yeah, so, it actually identifies, I think, 15 items to do over the next 8 years, which is where you're recalling 8 from. But it's clear we can't do everything in year 1 as much as that would be of value. We have limited capacity at a staff level, and just the number of meetings that there are before public bodies couldn't process 15 items in 1 year. So as part of the housing production strategy, it was prioritized which actions would occur in what order. This year we're looking at 2 things: developing an equitable housing plan. This falls more into the community development block grant requirement for that HUD requires of the city to look at equitability in housing as part of our update of our consolidated plan, a second plan that is required specifically for the use of federal funds. And then the adoption of the manufactured home park ordinance, which we've touched on previously. Independent of the city's efforts on those, there is, as I mentioned, a effort to look at developing a housing land trust, a group that's already meeting on that and looking at forming in order to address that concern. The land trust would be a mechanism by which land that is available could be purchased and then either held in a land bank or developed as housing that's either, low income, moderate income, or up to 120% area median income, and take the land out of the equation so that the household's only buying the building. We've had land trusts here in the past. Land got cost prohibitive to a degree that it wasn't necessarily viable. So I think this strategy would require considerable subsidy in terms of acquisition of land and construction costs. But again, so we've outlined these specific strategies in terms of accountability on this. There's Senate Bill 1537, which if you're not aware of yet, you likely will be by the end of this legislative session, because it identifies a number of state objectives to promote housing, such as expanding urban growth boundaries, looking at requiring cities grant exceptions to development proposals without, with a certain number of exceptions if it provides for needed housing. It also includes within that the development of what's called a Housing Accountability Office, by which the Department of Land Conservation and Development will be staffed up in order to reach back out to cities and make sure that the housing production strategies that are proposed in these documents are actually being carried out. So that really is the final slide in my presentation. Unless you had any questions, I wanted to go back to a prior slide.
Well, it seems to me that in looking at these housing strategies, that the ones that are really going to make a difference are the ones that involve money. That if there's a way to lower the cost of the production of the house, i.e. maybe take the land out, have a community trust or some other mechanism, that's the way we're going to get more housing for lower income folks here in Ashland. That's my 2 cents worth.
Your land costs are about $12 a square foot in the whole house price.
I thought it was bigger.
So it's not a lot.
Wow.
Yeah, I thought it was a lot more than that.
You're not buying. If you're building a 1,000 square foot home, you're not just buying 1,000 square feet of land. You're buying more than that.
Right, like 2,000
yeah.
square feet.
It's about $12, $13 a square foot.
Okay. So
Your SDC fees are $20 a square foot.
okay. So the city now does have a mechanism to waive or defer those
For low income.
for low income folks. And there's a bill in the Senate, I think it is, that's would allow those fees to be reimbursed by the state. So the city's going to come out whole on that. So how many people do you have coming to you to say, we'd like to defer the SDC costs?
It depends on the year. The development of affordable housing is cyclical. When the Housing Authority came forward with a 60-unit development, that was a significant contribution in terms of SDCs for that project. This year, we have 2 affordable housing units that have come in so far for a combined total of probably $30,000 in SDC waivers and additional $10,000 in community development and engineering service fee waivers. So again, if it was a significant number of units per year, the city probably would have to re-examine the waiver or deferral program. We did pass a number of years ago a allowance for somebody to pay those development fees over time, so they needn't pay them at the point of taking out the building permit, that they could pay them at a 0% interest loan for 1 year, or at time of occupancy, pay it when it's built as opposed to before they start, or take out a loan that's tied to the CPI for 5 years or I believe up to 10 years to pay them back over time. Probably more suitable for multifamily developments that have a revenue stream to pay back those STCs over time than for a new single-family home that would not likely want that on the deed after first transfer. So.
Since I've already touched on one controversial area, I'd like to just bring up a second one, ask a question of you. Has there been any recent, well, even not necessarily recent, but any inquiries in Ashland in regards to building taller than we have typically allowed?
I've not heard inquiries from the development community.
Yeah.
I think we've talked about it in this group as well as council in terms of climate-friendly area allowances going up to 50 feet as opposed to 35 feet to promote more stories of housing. Yeah, are you aware of anybody?
I think when we were doing the railroad plan, which was never formally adopted, we had one developer who was pushing for more height there in the 7-story range is what they thought was appropriate. And that, I mean, that, I don't think ever was incorporated into that plan, and that plan was never adopted anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But there, I mean, there was at least one developer out there who thought that would be appropriate.
The conceptual plan for a retirement community at SOU would love to envision a greater height, but I think that's going to be met with other neighborhood considerations regarding the view shed and that sort of thing.
No doubt. But I was thinking that if we're talking particularly 3 commercial districts, Plaza, SOU, and potentially Croman, should that ever come to pass, those would be logical areas to consider for the possibility of greater height that are going to have less of an impact on a residential neighborhood and potentially could give us some opportunities, seems to me, although I don't do construction, for affordable housing, or more affordable units, because you're going up as opposed to spreading out onto more and more land. So that's why I was interested if there'd been inquiries and we just had turned them away, or it sounds like we're already known that we don't do that just yet, or there's just no interest.
It may be that the inquiry hasn't come in the door, but you know, I do see sometimes people pushing up against the 35-foot limit for a single-family home. But as far as what you're describing in terms of multi-story development, I do know of a couple cases in which variants have been granted for exceeding the height of 45 feet or 40 feet 40. And going up to 45 feet, really to accommodate grade more than additional stories.
Okay, thank you.
One other maybe left field question, but so we're all very aware of wildfire risks in this area. Is that, again, it's not something I saw in the plan? Is it embedded into sub-elements, or is it a concern at all in terms of developing this kind of plan? Like roofing materials in Sun River, for example, everyone had to go from from wood shingle to composite roofs. That was a simple kind of thing.
Yeah, so again, in our land use ordinance and our building code, as well as our Chapter 9 nuisance ordinance, there are provisions that address wildfire. You can't have wood shingle roofs in Ashland.
Okay,
newly.
so that's more in the building code,
yeah,
as opposed to
right. So the building code also
design.
established a number of building hardening standards that get to wrapping your eaves and having ignition-resistant materials removed from within 5 feet of the perimeter of the building, vegetation controls and prohibited plant lists for highly flammable plants within that area. But as far as land use is concerned, I think the zoning is probably the best indicator of providing lower density in that urban forest interface and higher density on the valley floor, for lack of a better term. might be one consideration that was made by planners of the past in establishing those zones. We also have minimum requirements in terms of driveway lengths, proximity to fire hydrants, and those are under building code as well, or fire code.
And they're in the Environmental Resources Chapter 2, actually, which I didn't realize.
Yeah, the environmental resources covers hillside, floodplains, and wildfire hazards in that section of the comprehensive plan. So that would, those were referenced when passing the prohibited plant list, for instance, that it was in conformance with that section of the comprehensive plan.
Okay. Though
Always
Almeida
more to
would
do,
have, Almeida may have challenged the valley floor theory, right?
Most definitely. It was interesting, just to editorialize a little bit, that when the state last year was putting forth the wildfire hazard map, the statewide one, it identified areas that were at the highest risk of hazard. The burn scar from the Almeida fire was not included in that area. So, well, no, it was based on densities and topography. Exclusive of that, it was just a demonstration that the forest interface was at high risk. But I think we all know too
Wind
intimately
tunnels might
that
be too.
Building to building can be equally devastating.
Yeah, 50-mile-an-hour winds. If I may, are you done? I have a question if you're done.
Okay.
Just follow on that. Does the whole middle housing element and everything else affect what we're doing up on the urban wilderness interface, and that there are opportunities there to actually become more dense based on state standards?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, the middle housing land division that was required by the state establishes that any lot, well, first of all, duplexes are allowed on any lot that can have a single family home. So now that's 2 dwellings on a property that could previously be 1. When we passed the middle housing land division ordinance, we stipulated that it had to have full street frontage improvements, curb, gutter, sidewalk. That may limit the potential of new lots in some of those hillside areas that don't have those amenities and would have difficulty putting them in. But to answer your question, most assuredly the state law triggering increased densities does put more houses within that.
Yeah, I would think Chief Sartain has a strong opinion on that.
One thing that Ashland did is that we did our own study in terms of where the highest fire risk was, and identified that the entire city of Ashland is in what is considered a wildfire hazard area. And so our standards that previously only applied on the hillside in terms of fire hardening of homes and no wood shingles now apply citywide because the risk is there.
Well, that's good. Okay, so turning to the 2 things that you said on the HPS list of things that need to be done this year, 2024, one of them is to develop an equitable housing plan. Is that in our purview?
That is likely within the purview of the Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee and adoption by council. So,
can you help me with the definition of equitable on that?
I think it has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion to identify whether or not we have any policies that are disproportionately discriminatory. I'd have to get back to you on how HUD defines what they're looking for. Do you know?
You had some language in the write-up. It ties back to marginalized communities. So.
Okay, then.
So not income related. Well,
not
perhaps.
Not only, could be other factors.
Got it.
And the other one is?
The other one is
maintain
clearly
quality.
within your purview. The establishment of a manufactured home park zone. Currently, the manufactured home parks in Ashland are within multifamily zoned land, and there was concern that development pressure could displace manufactured homes in favor of multifamily development. And so the development of a manufactured home park zone would establish that the allowable uses within that zone would be limited to manufactured home parks, potentially a percentage of recreational vehicles, or tiny homes, something along that housing type. The intention is to look at existing manufactured home parks in Ashland as the obvious candidates for that zone application, but it is an effort to develop a new zoning type and, allowable uses, setbacks, all of those requirements. We do have a section within our land use code that directs manufactured home parks and how they develop, which might be a good model for the requirements for a zone.
A start,
Yeah.
okay. So last meeting, we had our plan for the year, and one of the issues on that plan was this mobile home park zone. And I asked if anybody was interested in helping staff out, or being an advisory to staff, or somehow participating in that development. And nobody raised their hand, so let me ask again, is there anybody who's particularly interested in working on this?
I have a question on top of that question.
Okay, go for it.
What's staff's plan as far as starting to put that together, time-wise?
We had actually applied for a grant for technical assistance to the Department of DLCD, and they did not approve our grant, but waitlisted it, said it was a valuable project that they'd like to fund if they are awarded more funding in this legislative session. So there has been a pause, in a sense, as to whether or not we would be able to get that technical assistance. I think our objective is to complete the plan by December, and we're in the end of February now. So regardless of the outcome of this legislative session, we're probably going to be developing a timeline scope, working from the end of council adoption back in order to determine when it would have to come to the Planning Commission and the Housing Commission.
So the work on that is going to get loaded up pretty soon.
It is. And unfortunately, concurrent with other long-range projects as well.
Yeah.
Current legislative session only has a couple of weeks to it, that's what.
Yeah, I think March 10th might be there.
Yep, March 10th is the end. Sure. So it's got another 12 days, 10 days.
Work hard.
Well, there's always hope. Okay, so we should expect to see that issue back on our plate
Most definitely.
soon.
I'm interested. I don't know if it's like I don't understand exactly what it means to be interested or participate yet. So, I mean, usually there's one or two people from this group that ends up being part of those processes. And it's going to be a hard question for you to answer, honestly, but do you actually feel that the participation of Planning Commission, like on the housing strategy process, was helpful? Lynn and I in there, and I'm asking honestly.
Yeah, I think it's helpful when it comes back to this body.
Because I understand it.
Because you're familiar with the process that we go through to get to that point, and are a resource for your fellow commissioners to ask questions of.
Okay.
Also in terms of the housing production strategy, I think, it helps in terms of the focus that you as a member of this commission that was on that advisory committee understand land use to the degree of what's feasible and what might not be. When somebody forwards a proposal that we should require 100% of a development to be affordable housing, it's a laudable goal. It's not going to, the property owner would just say, well, then I won't do anything.
Right.
So I think it's been useful in that regard.
Okay. I'm a maybe.
Chair, I recollect that I signed up for something last time, but I haven't heard back yet.
You have not.
Yeah, it was the economic opportunity analysis.
There we go.
And we are currently, just as an update, the Department of Land Conservation and Development has received our proposed scope of work. They're going to be modifying that and providing it back in a contract form. City of Medford already received their contract, so we're hopeful to get ours next week or so, so that we can send out that RFP at the same time as Medford's and ideally identify a consultant that could work in both communities concurrently.
Excellent. Look forward to it.
Okay, so I believe we're done with this discussion item. Moving on to the next issue on our agenda is open discussion. Does anybody have any open discussion items that they haven't already brought forward? Okay.
No.
How about adjourning? Who would like to make a motion that we adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we are adjourned.
Well done.
Thanks to
Thank you.
presentation and setting that up. It made for some great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Very helpful.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Night, Paula.
I'm sort of interested in